Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all our friends, delegates to the Kallanish Asia Steel Markets 2022. I'm very pleased to be here today to share with you the ASEAN steel industry, the recent developments and challenges. In my presentation today, I will cover three broad areas. Firstly, on the economies and COVID-19, then on the ASEAN steel industry situation, followed by the key development areas, which will be interesting for everybody. As far as COVID pandemic in ASEAN is concerned, as you can see on the chart, we've gone through so many different variants that have come up. 2020 was the original one, and 2021 was full of variants, the Alpha, the Delta, and the Omicron, right? As you can see from the chart, is that the Delta came sometime in the third quarter of 2021, which is a severe impact on the economies. The Omicron, big numbers, but it doesn't seem to be so severe. Death rates are low, hospitalization rates are low, and so therefore, nowadays, after Omicron, a lot of countries are looking at opening their borders to international travel for the vaccinated. Right. So as we speak right now, countries are now removing the restrictions to travel around the region. Singapore in particular, you will not need to take any further pre-departure tests for as long as you are vaccinated, and there's no quarantine either. So I expect a lot of countries will continue to follow this kind of process to open up their borders for travelers. So social distancing rules are also easing. Masks are still required in the public and crowded areas, but we see from now on a lot of activities, especially coming up in terms of tourism, construction, and other areas of the economy, right? Right. So these are all possible, because the countries have got low rates of infection right now, and a high number of vaccination. So this is good news for ASEAN, right? So now on this particular chart, we are talking about the quarterly GDP from 2019 to 2020 for the 6 ASEAN countries: Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam. Now the blue shaded columns are for 2019, the red shaded columns are for 2020, and the green shaded columns are for 2021. You can see that for all the countries, the blue shaded numbers are positive. They are all growing quarterly. When it comes to 2020, most of the countries have exhibited negative economic growth, all except Vietnam. You can see from the red numbers there. Then for the green color, that is for 2021, the main impact here is in the form of Delta. So when Delta hit, a number of countries have actually gone into another round of lockdown. And you can see Delta is in the black fonts in the center of the chart. Right? Countries affected were Malaysia, Thailand, and Vietnam, where they impose more lockdowns. But all in all, the 2021 in the very last row, you can see that all the countries are actually growing, and we are all looking forward economic recovery after Omicron. Now we will talk about the ASEAN steel industry situation, right? On this first slide, you can see that the ASEAN steel consumption in 2020 was 71.8 million tons. Right, you can see from the last column of the chart on the left, the biggest consumer, of course, is Vietnam, followed by Thailand and Indonesia, and Philippines, Malaysia, and Singapore. Right. So in 2021 first half, which is on the chart on the right side, you can also see that the numbers have gone up as demand have risen after all the lockdowns in 2020 the first half of 2020. Right, so the numbers are looking good. It's coming up as economies are recovering. On this particular chart, it shows us that in the blue columns, actually indicating production. What it tells us is that production has been stepping up in the various ASEAN countries. to support the local industry and the local demand when imports were not able to flow because of the disruption in the supply chain. And in the first half of 2021, you can see that the local industries have continued to support the demand in the various countries in ASEAN. In terms of imports, imports into ASEAN region are around 50 million tons a year. This has dropped to 42 million tons in 2020. Right? And if you were to look at the first half of the year, it seems like the import numbers are slowly coming back in the first half of 2021. Exports tell a different story, right? In spite of the pandemic and all the issues that we have in ASEAN, exports have continued to rise year after year since 2016. Now, what's the point here? I think the key point here is that before 2020, right, the rise in exports coincided with new capacities that have come up in places like Vietnam, Indonesia, and Malaysia. Okay, so new capacities in countries where certain sectors are already in overcapacity, so therefore the companies would have to export their goods, and this is in particular Malaysia with a new capacity, especially in the long product sector when that particular sector is in a total oversupply situation, right? So in 2020, again, the situation is different. While demand has fallen across the world, but China's demand has continued to grow, and because of supply chain disruptions, so ASEAN was able to supply to China in 2020. And this phenomena has been growing even through the first half of 2021. Exports have continued to grow from the ASEAN countries, mainly from Vietnam, Malaysia, and Indonesia. Okay, so in terms of forecast for 2021, we are looking at about 74.8 million tons. All countries from ASEAN have will see a growth in demand, except for Vietnam, which had a very serious lockdown to contain Delta and Omicron in 2021. Right. So all in all, it's growing slowly, but we have not reached pre-pandemic level yet. So now we'll go on to the key developments, the three key areas in ASEAN. First, let's talk about Ukraine war, right? So ASEAN's trade with Russia and Ukraine is actually pretty small, right? You're looking at 0.7% of the ASEAN's global trade. Direct impact is very minimum, right? Also on the left chart, you can see imports from Russia is only 0.8% of all imports. Exports is only 0.5% of all exports. But what is interesting to note is that the imports include a lot of fuels, mineral oils, mostly coal, iron and steel, and fertilizers, and all those kind of things. For exports, electrical equipment, mechanical machinery, and vehicles. Similarly, for Ukraine, iron and steel is also there, but from Ukraine, again, the numbers are small, right? So it's only 0.1% of all imports, and mostly cereals, animal food, iron and steel. And for export to Ukraine, it's also small, 0.1%. Again, electrical equipment, vehicles, and mechanical machinery, right? So direct impact is actually pretty minimum, right? Affects energy sector, food sector, iron and steel, but it's minimum, if you're talking about direct trade. In terms of indirect impact, it's a lot bigger, right? So we have an energy crisis, food crisis, supply chain disruption, leading to commodity prices increases, inflation, and interest rates are coming up, right? So most of the ASEAN countries have not yet increased interest rates except for Singapore, but the subsidy, given to the public will have to end. It's a matter of time, and the subsidy that has been given out right now is actually a diversion of the funds from recovery, economic recovery post-pandemic, right? So with the increase in all these costs, and you're going to see increase in business risk and a lot of pressure on demand. Right? So what we're going to see is that we're going to see demand slow down, slower recovery, regional decoupling because of issues coming up from Ukraine and Russian area, and then of course supply chain shifts, which will continue to grow over time. Right. So this one, the number seems pretty small, but when you start looking at the steel side, you see that ASEAN doesn't import a lot of products from Russia and Ukraine in terms of steel, but they do import a fair number of semi-finished products like billets, slabs, and high carbon billets and things like that, and of course coking coals for steel production. Right. So on the left chart, you can see the numbers are very small. The red and the blue areas are coming from Ukraine and Russia. But on the right chart, you can see that the import of semis from Ukraine and Russia is quite significant at 17.4%. Right. So Philippines imports 42% of their semi-finished products from this region. That's a lot. Indonesia 27% and Thailand 11.5%. Okay, so the ASEAN countries like these three will have to look at alternative supplies of semi-finished products, semi-finished steel from other parts of the world. Right, so next on investment, this is a perennial issue in the ASEAN region. ASEAN is an attractive region, so people are looking at continue to invest in ASEAN. And the investments in ASEAN have focused on basically three countries, right? Indonesia, Malaysia, and Vietnam. And these are dominated by investments from China, right? So on a map, you can see red color dots are investments in Malaysia, the blue color dots, Indonesia, purple, Philippines, and green will be Vietnam, right? And the yellow dots here are just an indication of all the stainless steel projects in Indonesia. A lot of them focus on one island, but of course there are also other stainless steel projects across the region. Like in Philippines and all that. So on the right table, you can see this is a list of the projects that have been announced, planned, announced, and some of them under construction. You can see a lot of them are under construction, and these are big projects, like 10 million tons, 3 million tons, and 5.6 million tons and all that, right? So on the right side, you can see there are some red flags. These red flags indicate these various projects are actually the Chinese projects in the region. Okay, so there are many investments coming in ASEAN, and it is a major concern, especially if you look at the example that I've put in the middle of in the top right hand side of the chart, using Malaysia as an example, right? The apparent steel consumption or demand, sometimes as we call it, at best has been about 10 million tons. The current capacity overall is about 16 million tons, but the potential capacity all in is 46, right? So you have got 46 million tons versus a demand of 10 million tons. It's a gross oversupply. But obviously, a lot of investments coming into ASEAN is not about supplying to the domestic industry. It is also looking at supplying to the region, especially in China. Okay, right. So on the next chart, right? So I have done a bit of forecast to look at the impact of the growth in the investments in ASEAN. On the left chart, it tells you that the green area are arc furnaces, arc furnace investments, and the red ones are BOFs that are expected to be invested in ASEAN, right? So from a very small number of BOFs, blast furnace BOFs are being installed in ASEAN, it has grown up to 2020, and we're going to see a continuing growth in the investment of blast furnace and blast BOFs, right? So if you look at the proportion of crude steel capacity by technology on the right chart, you can see that from 2011, it's only 5% from blast furnace and BOFs and 95% from EAFs. However, the moment we reach to 2026, you're going to see a reversal in the proportions, and more of these will come from blast furnace BOFs compared to EAFs, right? And with more investments coming in, it's going to get more and more, I would say, less green, right? So ASEAN is on the way towards degreening, as far as the ASEAN steel industry is concerned, right? And if we were to look at the next slide, which is on carbon emissions, right? So what I've used here is I've used EU benchmarks for blast furnaces and for EAFs. And you can see here from 2020, right, of a total emission of about 42 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, is going to hit 122 million tons in 2026, which is a 3 times growth in carbon dioxide emissions within a short period of about 6 years. Now, okay, so these are conservative numbers because blast furnaces also require sinter plants and coke production, and the emission numbers here do not include carbon emissions from coke plants as well as sintering operations. So the growth of 3 times could even become 4 times. Okay, and the proportion of carbon dioxide emissions by technology, you're going to see about close to 90% of that quantity coming from blast furnace BOFs in the ASEAN region. Okay, so the last slide, quick one on climate change. The ASEAN economies have actually, been working on climate change mitigation, right? They are starting to put policies in place to make sure that carbon emissions are being controlled, and most of these come in the form of carbon tax and emissions trading. Okay, so the ASEAN initial strategy on these climate change policies about moving away from coal-based energy sources, right? But this is difficult because coal and fossil fuels, they are not easy for you to move away from due to price and availability, right? So if you look on the right chart, you can see that the red columns, are basically sources of energy using coal, and you can see a number of ASEAN countries are actually very dependent on coal for energy, followed by natural gas and oil. And all these are very expensive, except for coal, which are mostly from Indonesia. Okay, so all of them, right, to control all these things, have introduced a lot of laws. Right? Singapore started with carbon tax, and Indonesia will start this year, right? And many countries are actually moving towards setting up a carbon emission trading system over the next 5-10 years. Private sectors are following the direction of what the governments are doing. And what is most important news of late is that the ASEAN has released the first draft of taxonomy in November 2021. Right? And what the taxonomy says is that they will be classifying all investment projects into 3 categories: green, but it could be a bit polluting, and of course those that are not green. And then they will design the various taxes or funding requirements based on the taxonomy, right? And of course, the taxonomy will be aligned with other taxonomies, and one of them being the EU taxonomy, which is already running in Europe right now. Okay, so a quick one on carbon tax, and I think this carbon pricing in ASEAN is an important thing. Singapore has started the carbon tax in 2019, and it will continue to 2023 at the current rate of 5 Sing dollars per ton of carbon emissions. Right. So this one will change in 2023. You're going to see the cost rise by 5 times to 25 Sing dollars per ton of carbon emitted. And by 2026, it will be 45, and reaching 2030, it's going to become 50 to 80 dollars a ton, Sing dollars a ton. Right. So these are for companies that emit more than 25,000 tons of greenhouse gases per year in Singapore. For Indonesia, they are starting with this cap and trade and cap and tax system with $2.10 US dollars, starting with the energy sectors. And Indonesia has already passed into law that individuals and entities that buy goods containing carbon and or carry out activities that produce carbon emissions will have to bear the cost of carbon. Okay, so they are also looking at starting an emissions trading system by 2025. Right, so the Indonesia system is somewhat similar to what you can find in Europe, but of course it will be refined further over the years, followed by the other ASEAN countries around the region. Okay, so that is all for my presentation today. I'm very pleased to be here to be able to share with you some of the things that are developing in ASEAN. And I thank you very much for your attention.